The jungle of Vietnam hides many forgotten scars, places where men fought, bled, and vanished into history. One of those scars lies high above the A Shau Valley, a lonely ridge wrapped in clouds and silence. Its name was Firebase Eagle's Nest, a place that saw everything, fired through hell, and disappeared before the world ever knew it existed. Before we dive into this forgotten battle, I just want to take a moment to say thank you. Your incredible support has been unreal. Every like, comment, and share has helped this channel grow faster than we ever imagined. And we're hard on our way to 20,000 subscribers. If you haven't yet, make sure to hit that subscribe button and join us on this journey through the hidden corners of military history. Now, back to Vietnam. It's mid-1970. The A Shau Valley is a nightmare, a corridor of death carved between jungle mountains. Down below, the North Vietnamese army is gathering for one of their biggest offensives. And above it all, perched on the edge of the clouds, sits a small American outpost armed with nothing but artillery, courage, and the will to survive. This is the story of Firebase Eagle's Nest, the forgotten guardian of the A Shau. To understand Firebase Eagle's Nest, you first have to understand the place it was built to watch, the A Shau Valley. A long, narrow stretch of jungle running along the border with Laos, the valley was more than just another piece of terrain. It was the beating heart of the Ho Chi Minh Trail, the lifeline that carried men, weapons, and supplies from North Vietnam into the south. Hidden beneath the thick canopy, the North Vietnamese army had built a shadow empire. Underground bunkers, storage depots, even makeshift hospitals. To the U.S. Army, the A Shau wasn't just dangerous. It was vital. Whoever controlled the high ground overlooking the valley controlled the flow of war, but holding it was almost impossible. The weather was brutal, the jungle impenetrable, and every ridgeline seemed to be crawling with enemy eyes. That's where the 101st Airborne Division came in. By 1968, the Screaming Eagles had established a ring of fire bases around the valley. Bastogne, Birmingham, Ripcord, Veghel, and Eagle's Nest. Each was perched high on a mountain, isolated, surrounded by mist, and within artillery range of the valley floor. Together, they formed a deadly circle of steel meant to keep the NVA at bay. But for the men stationed there, it was a living nightmare. Constant monsoon rain, thick fog that grounded helicopters for days, supply shortages, disease, and the ever-present sound of distant mortars echoing through the hills. In the middle of it all, standing higher than most, was Firebase Eagle's Nest, a lonely watchtower in the clouds, staring straight into enemy country. When the 101st Airborne first began carving Firebase Eagle's Nest out of the Vietnamese mountains, they weren't just building a base, they were claiming a piece of hell. Everything had to be brought in by helicopter. Timber, steel plates, sandbags, barbed wire, even food and ammunition. Every landing was a gamble. The valley below was filled with enemy gunfire, and the thick jungle canopy offered perfect cover for hidden NVA positions. Pilots flew through narrow gaps in the fog, often under fire, just to drop a few crates of supplies before pulling back into the clouds. The men on the ground had no easy days. They hacked away at the earth with shovels and picks, laying down steel landing pads and digging deep trenches into the rock. The air was heavy with rain and humidity, the kind that soaked through every layer of clothing and never went away. When the monsoon hit, the entire fire base turned into a river of mud. At night, they worked by red-filtered flashlights, fortifying the perimeter with claymores and trip flares. From their mountaintop, they could see flashes of distant artillery echoing across the valley. It was a constant reminder. They were surrounded. There was no town nearby, no road in or out. Just endless jungle and the hum of distant engines in the sky. For weeks at a time, Eagle's Nest was cut off completely when the weather closed in. No resupply, no medevac. Only static-filled radio chatter linking them to the outside world. Up there, time moved differently. Days blurred into nights. And for the soldiers of the 101, Firebase Eagle's Nest quickly became known as the outpost at the end of the world. By early 1970, The men of Firebase Eagle's Nest were living in a state of constant tension. Every morning began with the same sound, the dull thump of distant mortars echoing through the valley, followed by the high-pitched whistle that made every heartbeat stop for a second. Then the explosions came. Dirt, steel, and shrapnel tore through the mist, shaking the fragile bunkers that barely held together. The North Vietnamese army was testing them. They never launched a full assault, not yet. Instead, they preferred to bleed the firebase slowly, random mortar attacks, sniper fire from the ridgelines, and small probing squads crawling up through the jungle at night. The message was clear: you're not safe here. For the soldiers, sleep became a rare luxury. They spent their nights behind sandbags, scanning the tree line for movement. Some nights they could hear voices in the jungle, whispers carried by the wind other times. Flares lit up the mountainside, revealing nothing but rain and shadows. Between attacks, the men repaired damage, refilled sandbags, and checked their claymores again and again. The mud never dried, the air never cooled, and the fear never left. But somehow they held on. They learned to read the jungle. They could tell the difference between the rustle of wind and the footstep of an enemy scout. They memorized every sound the valley made, every echo, every silence. And deep down, every man knew this was only the beginning. The NVA was gathering strength somewhere in that endless green abyss. And sooner or later, the real fight would come to the ridge. By the spring of 1970, the war around the A Shau Valley had entered a new phase. The U.S. Command launched Operation Texas Star, a massive push led by the 101st Airborne Division to disrupt enemy movements and destroy supply lines feeding the Ho Chi Minh Trail. From their mountaintop fortress, Firebase Eagle's Nest became one of the operation's sharpest weapons. Artillery crews worked around the clock. The 105mm and 155mm howitzers positioned at Eagle's Nest could hit targets miles away, raining shells on enemy camps hidden in the valley below. Observers guided the fire from helicopters, calling in strikes on convoys, bunkers, and anti-aircraft positions. Each explosion was followed by the same radio message: splash, over. But every time the Americans reached further into the valley, the NVA struck back harder. Mortar fire intensified. Enemy rockets slammed into the firebase, sending shock waves through the bunkers. On one day alone, Eagle's Nest took over 150 incoming rounds in less than an hour. Resupply became dangerous. Helicopters had to dive in low and fast, unloading in seconds before pulling out again. The landing zone was littered with shrapnel and burned debris, silent proof of how close the war was creeping. Still, the men of the 101st held their ground. They had come to understand that this was no ordinary mission. The A Shau wasn't just an enemy stronghold, it was the nerve center of the war in central Vietnam. And as May turned to June, intelligence reports painted a grim picture. Thousands of NVA troops were gathering in the jungles below. Their target wasn't just the valley, it was the entire ring of American fire bases surrounding it. The storm was coming, and Eagle's Nest was directly in its path. By early July 1970, the A Shau Valley had exploded into chaos. Down below, Firebase Ripcord, one of Eagle's Nest's sister bases, was under siege. Thousands of North Vietnamese troops had surrounded it, hammering it day and night with mortars, rockets, and ground assaults. The 101st Airborne was trapped, fighting for every inch of their position. From their mountain perch just a few miles away, the men at Firebase Eagle's Nest could see the smoke rising over Ripcord. They could hear the distant thunder of explosions echoing through the valley, a grim symphony that never stopped. And when the call came over the radio, fire mission, Ripcord defense, they knew exactly what it meant. Every gun at Eagle's Nest opened up. The artillery crews worked like machines, load, fire, repeat, sending round after round screaming into the jungle below. Their target grids were marked in red: enemy mortar pits, troop concentrations, and anti-aircraft nests choking the valley. The barrels of their howitzers glowed from the heat, the air thick with smoke and the stench of burnt gunpowder. But the NVA struck back. Eagle's Nest came under constant counter-battery fire as enemy gunners tracked the flash of American artillery and fired in return. Incoming rounds slammed into the perimeter, shredding sandbags, flattening bunkers, and sending shrapnel through the air like knives. Men dove into trenches as explosions ripped through their positions. Some of them had no helmets left, only bandages and dirt. The radio never stopped. Ripcord was running low on ammunition, and helicopters couldn't reach them. Eagle's Nest became their lifeline, relaying coordinates, adjusting artillery, and guiding the few surviving choppers through narrow corridors of cloud and fire. Veterans later said it felt like fighting blind. They couldn't see the enemy, only the smoke and flashes far below. But they knew that every round they fired meant another American life saved at Ripcord. Still, they could sense the inevitable. As the days dragged on, the reports grew worse. Casualties mounting, positions overrun, helicopters shot down one after another. And then came the order that no one wanted to hear. Ripcord was to be evacuated. When the final helicopters lifted off under heavy fire, Eagle's Nest watched the valley below erupt in flames. The Americans destroyed Ripcord's guns, ammo, and bunkers, leaving nothing behind. The valley that had swallowed so many now claimed another fire base. And through it all, Eagle's Nest kept firing, even as they themselves came under siege. For over 3 weeks, the men on that lonely ridge fought to keep their guns alive, their comrades protected, and their position intact. By the time the smoke cleared, the 101st Airborne had lost over 130 men at Ripcord, with hundreds more wounded. The siege was one of the last major battles the division would ever fight in Vietnam. But high above that battlefield, on a ridge wrapped in cloud and silence, Firebase Eagle's Nest had done its duty. It had held the line when everything below was falling apart. When the guns at Firebase Ripcord finally went silent, the valley below was unrecognizable, a sea of blackened craters and burning jungle. For the men at Firebase Eagle's Nest, the sound of silence was almost worse than the bombardment itself. They had spent weeks firing nonstop, guiding artillery and watching the sky glow orange every night. Now all that remained was smoke, static, and the haunting emptiness of a lost outpost. But the war wasn't done with them. Within hours of Ripcord's evacuation, the North Vietnamese turned their full attention toward Eagle's Nest. They knew the Americans had lost a critical foothold, and they wanted the high ground next. The first rockets came screaming in before sunrise, tearing into bunkers and communications posts. Mortar rounds followed, pounding the perimeter until the earth itself shook. Men scrambled to return fire, some still half asleep, others bleeding and covered in mud. They fired their own mortars until the tubes overheated, shells landing on unseen targets deep in the fog. Helicopters trying to resupply the fire base were met with heavy anti-aircraft fire. Some never made it back. Every landing became a gamble with death. The enemy never launched a full-scale ground assault, but the message was clear. The 101st was being pushed out of the A Shau Valley, one ridge at a time. By mid-August. The order came down from division headquarters. Eagle's Nest would be abandoned. The men who had survived Ripcord's fall now faced the same bitter task: destroy everything, burn the records, and leave nothing behind for the enemy to claim. They dismantled the artillery they had fired for months, packed explosives into ammo pits, and watched their own base go up in flames. As the helicopters lifted them away, smoke rose from the mountaintop. The last American fire base still standing in that corner of the valley for the soldiers of the 101st Airborne. The war in the A Shau was over. But what they left behind was more than just burned steel and craters. They left behind a place that had tested their limits, a lonely fortress that refused to die quietly. By early 1971, the war in Vietnam was changing. Washington had begun Vietnamization, the slow handover of combat operations to South Vietnamese forces. For the 101st Airborne Division, it meant one thing: pull back, consolidate, and leave the mountains behind. The days of holding isolated fire bases deep in enemy country were over. Firebase Eagle's Nest, once a vital artillery post, now stood quiet. The guns that had thundered day and night during the Ripcord siege were gone. The sandbags sagged from months of rain, and the bunkers, once alive with radio chatter and the rhythm of artillery fire, had become hollow shells filled with silence. Helicopters came one last time to extract the remaining troops and supplies. The men moved slowly, exhausted and wary, scanning the ridges they had fought to hold. Before leaving, engineers placed explosive charges in the ammo bunkers and command posts, ensuring nothing could be used by the NVA. Moments later, the mountains echoed one final time as Eagle's Nest went up in smoke. Within days, the jungle began to reclaim the ridge. Vines crept over the shattered timber, monsoon rains washed away the trenches, and soon even the helicopter pads disappeared beneath the green. Only the scars in the earth remained, silent proof that men had once fought, suffered, and survived there. When the 101st finally left Vietnam for good, Eagle's Nest was gone, just another forgotten name in a war full of them. But for those who stood on that mountaintop, it was more than a dot on a map. It was a place where they learned what endurance truly meant, a place where bravery lived quietly, high above the valley of death. Decades later, the men who served at Firebase Eagle's Nest still remember the sounds, the constant hiss of rain on metal, the echo of distant explosions rolling through the valley, and the silence that came after each attack. A silence so heavy it felt like the mountain itself was holding its breath. Many of them were barely 20 years old, far from home, fighting a war that few understood. They remember the smell of burnt gunpowder, the taste of mud, and the numb exhaustion that came after days without sleep. Some still wake up at night hearing the shriek of incoming rounds. That split second before impact that never leaves your mind. Yet despite the fear and loss, they also remember the brotherhood. The jokes shared in the trenches, the coffee boiled over tiny stoves, and the quiet moments staring out over the valley, wondering if anyone would ever know what happened there. For most of the world, Firebase Eagle's Nest was just another name on a military map, overshadowed by the tragedy at Ripcord. But for the men who lived it, it was everything. It was where they learned courage wasn't about victory, it was about endurance, about holding your ground when the world below you falls apart. Today, the jungle has taken back the ridge, but the memories remain, carved into the minds of those who stood there, watching the clouds drift over the A Shau Valley, the same clouds that once carried the echoes of war high above the jungles of Vietnam. On a ridge long swallowed by time, there once stood a fortress in the clouds, Firebase Eagle's Nest, forgotten by history, but never by the men who called it home. It wasn't a grand battlefield. There were no medals, no headlines, no victory parades, only mud, fear, and the will to endure one more day. Yet in that endurance lay something extraordinary. The quiet courage of soldiers who refused to break, even as the war around them fell apart. The A Shau Valley would change hands again and again. Fire bases like Ripcord and Eagle's Nest would vanish, buried beneath jungle and silence. But the legacy of those who fought there still echoes through the mist. A reminder that even in the darkest places, bravery can burn bright, unseen by the world. If you enjoyed this story and want to uncover more forgotten battles of the Vietnam War, make sure to like this video and subscribe. Your support keeps these stories alive, one forgotten firebase at a time. This was Firebase Eagle's Nest, the lost stronghold of the 101st Airborne. And as the clouds close over the A Shau once more, its silence still whispers. We were here, thank you for watching. Your time and support mean everything. And together we'll keep remembering the men, the missions, and the moments history tried to forget.